Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Sizing Up the Enterprise Container Market, hosted by 451 Research. Today I'm joined by Jay Lyman and Greg Zwockman. For those of you unfamiliar with 451, we're an IT research and advisory analyst firm providing syndicated research and data products, custom advisory services, and industry events. Founded in 2000, we've grown to a 100-plus strong analyst team that publishes over 4,500 reports each year and updates over 52 million data points each quarter. Our insight is consumed by our 1,000-plus client organizations and our community of 60,000-plus IT professionals. Along with our sister company, Uptime Institute, the 451 Group is headquartered in New York City and operates offices across the globe. Our research provides insight into emerging disruptive technologies and the companies taking them to market. In fact, each year we cover over 2,000 incumbent players and startups. Our research and data products are both qualitative and quantitative and deliver both competitive and market intelligence. Our analysts are plugged into the digital economy and actively leverage our proprietary global community of IT professionals. Before I hand it over to Jay, a few housekeeping items. There will be a Q&A at the end of today's webinar, so please submit your questions through the BrightTalk interface at any time. The slides are available for download in the attachments folder of BrightTalk, and don't forget to leave feedback before signing off today. Over to you, Jay.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks to our listeners for your time and interest today. Just briefly, we'll go over the agenda. We'll take a look, sort of a high-level look at the enterprise container market, just touch on some of what's driving it, what it's all about, and then we'll go into some of the container market size. I'll turn it over briefly to my colleague Greg Zwockman to talk about our methodology and a little bit of the data. Then we'll dive a little bit deeper on one of our subsegments of the container market, the container management and orchestration segment. And then we'll sort of end with, again, just looking at what are the drivers, what are the challenges, what's the outlook for containers in the enterprise. And there will be a chance to ask questions. You can use the BrightTalk interface to do that. So without further ado, let's get into our discussion of what, and like I said, we'll just start with a high-level perspective on the container market, and it probably makes sense to start with a brief definition of what is a container. And it's an application container consists of an entire runtime environment, an application plus all of its dependencies, libraries, and other binaries, as well as the configuration files needed to run it. And this is all bundled into a virtual container that can run on a variety of infrastructures. May sound like magic, but there's more to it than that. But basically, the modern application containers that we are talking about today are a simplified version, and Docker and other container software has worked to sort of democratize containers. So something that you previously may have been able to do in a operating system or a programming language like Python, but you would have been had required to be a deeper expert in that, and it's been simplified quite a bit more when we talk about these modern application containers. What we're showing with this slide is just that we do see containers as a high priority for enterprise organizations, and this is from our Voice of the Enterprise survey research. I think around 1,000 enterprise IT decision makers polled for this one, primarily in North America, Europe, and Asia. And this is our fairly recent research from October, November, and December when these folks were polled. And containers, as you can see, are among the newer categories here, but among the higher priorities for organizations. And right there with big data processing and software-defined networking, which have both been around quite a bit longer than modern application containers. And we also see containers with other hot new technologies like machine learning and serverless. And I think, this also highlights how we do see a somewhat chronological order of in adoption of these new technologies. It starts with cloud computing, typically, and then we see DevOps and big data applications and technologies normally. And then we tend to see containers and microservices being adopted, and then serverless also. We see a lot of interest in that. That seems to be moving rapidly this is similar to what we saw with containers. And just briefly on the drivers, I'll talk more about this later, but I mean, containers are being driven largely by the need to speed up and better serve developers. We also see efficiency as a big driver and some consolidation of VMs by containers the same way that VMs consolidated physical servers. Nevertheless, they coexist, and we expect that to continue. I'll talk more about that as well. But basically, containers deliver a lower overhead. And also, the portability of containers is in step with hybrid cloud adoption among enterprises and service providers that want to run their applications across different infrastructures, across public cloud, private cloud, on-premise infrastructure, different public clouds, basically a multi-hybrid cloud world, and containers fit that pretty well. And overall, I'd say one of the biggest drivers of containers has been good timing with enterprise adoption of cloud computing, primarily public, but also private cloud. Organizations were asking, as containers arrived on the scene 3-4 years ago, how do you package and deploy applications in the cloud? And containers make a lot of sense for that. And now we're seeing a similar synergy with container management and orchestration software, such as Kubernetes. Good timing with hybrid cloud. Kubernetes is a distributed application framework, and it makes sense for some of these hybrid cloud deployments. So bottom line, containers are for real. We do see, we'll talk about the market and the value of that. There's agility, cost, portability, and other advantages that are driving the software, like Docker, Kubernetes, and many other projects, and as we'll see, vendors. We also see prominent demand and skills gap around containers. And I think this highlights how demand for container expertise is exceeding supply based on the surveys that we see and what we hear about out there. It's a top skill and experience in need by enterprises. And it's interesting to note here that the only platform certifications that are poised for growth are the hyperscale public cloud providers. The exception to that being open source platforms and open source software such as OpenStack and Docker and Kubernetes, which experience some of the most significant growth in criticality over the next 2 years. So, I think this also highlights how important open source software is in the container market, and all of the container runtime software, all of the container management and orchestration options are open source software projects. And as I said, we do have, we'll see in a bit here, no shortage of companies building commercial products with enterprise extensions and features and services on top of that open source software and making money from these open source software components. But no question that sort of open source software and community is a big part of this market. We get a sense of how fast container software is making its way into the enterprise market by also looking at production use. And this is among container using organizations. So it's not all organizations, but nevertheless, it is indicative of rapid movement to production and consistent with what we're hearing from vendors and end users. And I think, containers been around 3-4 years, and we have been seeing a pretty steady increase in the number of containerized applications moving to production beyond just test and dev and trials. To see this for the container management and orchestration software, even within container using organizations, I think this is significant and indicative of some of the sort of wild growth that we're seeing of Kubernetes. Still some sort of complexity and production challenges, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But nevertheless, a fast move to production for containers and container management and orchestration software. And this is also faster than we've seen with previous trends and technologies, such as DevOps or platform as a service or OpenStack, which took longer to get to production uses. And I think perhaps because of that timing that I mentioned with cloud. Timing for those trends wasn't quite as good as containers. With enterprise adoption of cloud. And so, we just see whereby we had, discussions mainly with investors and vendors and not as many end users on the other trends, on DevOps, on PaaS. With containers, we've seen interest and inquiries from large enterprise end users almost from the start. That I think ties also somewhat to the open source software, but again, evidence that this market is moving pretty rapidly. So now just to get a sense that we talked about, the enterprise container landscape, let's turn to the market size. And for that, I'm going to turn it over briefly to Greg Zwockman, who heads our market monitor team and our market sizing research. Greg?
Thank you very much, Jay. So I guess all the container fans who are dialed in here are probably familiar with Jay and his work, but probably not familiar with me or my team. So what I do is I oversee the company's market monitor practice, which consists of a portfolio of market sizing and forecasting data services that identifies, tracks, and forecasts the long tail of competitors within each market. And these are actually designed to be customized for specific client use cases. So here, the data, or again, the quant side, we call it, or the analyst, or the qualitative side of the house, we do not operate in standalone silos. We're not rivals. We actually talk to each other. So my team is embedded within our core research teams. And for this exercise, application containers, which is a subsegment of our cloud enabling technology service, we work in concert ongoing with Jay and his team to actually maintain this analysis, which we update quarterly. So just to touch on a few areas where this sort of analysis is different. Really, again, the methodology. We look at a bottom-up approach. So we're tracking every company. So this is looking at the complete kind of vendor landscape. Market leaders, the next tier in terms of the small, private, well-funded companies, and the startups, oftentimes pressuring the group to do new and more kind of innovative things. There is no black box other kind of forecast here, so we can tie individual, or we can tie this revenue to the companies that are actually generating it. A way you can vet and validate those different figures. We can get very granular, in individual companies, segment, subsegment, feature set, geographic, use cases. Again, we put out quarterly reports and data files, but we can do on-demand access with analyst insights, specific cuts with the analyst team, talking about the assumptions behind them. So we can combine the market data, the expert insight, and generate solutions that are actually unique to what a client is trying to figure out in a way that the client can understand how the data is put together, and how, ultimately to vet that data as well. So the data on the coming slides is really the tip of the iceberg, right, in terms of the detail that we can get into. Unfortunately, this is a public presentation. We can't, again, reveal all the details or speak to those details, but something we can do on follow-up conversations. So looking at the scope quickly, Jay already talked about the definition, and we'll touch on the segments in a minute. I just want to spend on the scope of the analysis. So what we include are software license, software maintenance, services support, again, including with the software, so no third-party service providers, no, again, consulting, planning, strategy. And we also include revenue associated with integrated container appliances. So not standalone hardware that's sold separately that may be leveraged to support the software functionality. It needs to be directly container-based. So again, within this segment, we're modeling and forecasting 154 individual companies. This number that we've been tracking this market for a while. The number of actual companies participating has increased very quickly. And as we go through 2018, even the next update, we're going to have new companies entering this space. And again, touching on the methodology, what you're seeing, it's we can tie it back. It is strictly vendor supported. So again, no black box. Again, a revenue figure comes into these overall figures. So in aggregate, we believe the revenue from these 154 companies accounted for just over $1 billion in 2017, and we believe that's going to grow to just under $3.5 billion by the end of 2021. Now, while this CAGR looks impressive, we would classify this as a reasonable conservative forecast. As when we look at the vendor by vendor forecasts that make up the total, we believe they are quite achievable. So last, looking at the individual segments, and again, we're not going to break out each one of these, but Jay, kind of here on out, I'm going to turn it back over to Jay, who's going to provide some more color on the different segmentation and outline some of the drivers and challenges facing this space. So Jay, back to you.
Yes, thanks very much, Greg. And yeah, just some highlights of each of these subsegments, which is how we divided our application container market map, which was published in 2016. In that map, vendors were placed in multiple buckets. For the market sizing, for now, we place them in one of these primary buckets. So for vendors in container management orchestration, and obviously they might have some networking or storage capabilities or features in their software, in their offering, that would be reflected in the previous market map, not necessarily in the market size. But there is one place where we're, where our research is going, and the sort of segments are meant to be fluid and reflective of the market. So if they're blurring together, we may do that with our sizing. And I'll just sort of go over them in order here. Container management and orchestration, obviously a very hot area, and not surprisingly our biggest subsegment in terms of revenue. And this is made up of vendors backing container management and orchestration software, mostly Kubernetes, but others too. This is where you would find Red Hat with OpenShift, companies like CoreOS, Heptio, Docker with Swarm, and its Kubernetes support, Mesosphere doing the same, Rancher with its software and integration with Kubernetes, HashiCorp with Nomad and its Kubernetes integration, and a number of other vendors, including Pivotal and VMware with PKS. This is also where we place the public cloud providers, AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, with their respective container services, which are very relevant in the market. And we'll talk a bit more about this subsegment of the container market later on. The container monitoring and logging, this is our second largest subsegment in the market, and we often hear it is among the first needs for organizations running containers to know what's in the containers and what they're doing. This subsegment includes traditional monitoring and logging vendors such as BMC, CA, Dynatrace, New Relic, and Splunk, and others, as well as newcomers and container-specific players such as Datadog, Graylog, and Sysdig. In the container data management and services, another significant subsegment in our market sizing, this includes traditional open source and NoSQL database vendors. This would be where you'd find Oracle, CouchDB, Blue Data, MariaDB, and MapR, as well as newer vendors like Sphere 3D and data analytics player Pachyderm. And also some, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but we're seeing more and more stateful applications being containerized, not just web and stateless. And this is where I think, the data management and data services may have a bigger role as we go forward and we get into more complex data-rich applications that are being containerized. Container security is one of our smaller categories, but certainly an important one, given the priority on security, and that security is viewed as among the top challenges of containerized applications. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well, but this is where we would place vendors like Aqua, Banyan, Capsule, Curtail, DeepFence, Layered Insight, NewVector, Twistlock, and others. They're focused on securing container deployments, container applications, and container deployments. And this category really grew dramatically last year as we went from only a few vendors in the market the prior year to well over a dozen. In terms of container networking and container storage, also both smaller subsegments of the market, but we're starting to see both move beyond plugins and focus specifically on container networking and container storage with vendors such as Appareto in networking, Diamante in storage. We may also see more rapid growth of this category as well with what I mentioned of this second wave of stateful applications that require data persistence. And again, with more complex data-rich applications, there's more of a need to have a container-specific storage, and certainly network is also, I think, growing as we see container applications move beyond just the dev and test, beyond just developers, and increasingly hitting the IT operations side of organizations. And then our last category here of CI/CD and DevOps category, actually the third largest subsegment by revenue in containers, and this includes a large number of vendors, old and new. Atlassian, Bitnami, CircleCI, CodeShip, and this is also where you'd find Chef, Puppet, HashiCorp, Weaveworks, Electric Cloud, JFrog, Cantina, Plutora, and Zebia Labs. So again, a large number of vendors that are focused on continuous integration, continuous deployment, and incorporate containers into their strategy and software. And as I said, these subsegments, we will adjust these over time. We've done that with other market sizing research, where we will combine some of the subsegments. For now, these still seems to make sense, and based on that earlier application market map that we published. So now let's go a bit deeper on the container management and orchestration software. Again, our largest subsegment of the container market by revenue. And if I can just move forward one slide here, as you can see here, it represents roughly a third of the overall container market revenue, and that's currently the case and projected to continue through 2021. And we certainly have, I think, the most crossover into other categories from container management and security, networking and storage. And as I said, this research is fluid and reactive to the market, and the subsegments that I went over before are not written in stone. So if the crossover becomes, integration, we'll adjust accordingly. But no question, I think this is where a lot of the action is. A lot of folks, Kubernetes comes to mind. There are other options out there in the market, and that's a little bit of what we found. These are some of the key findings from our recently published container management and orchestration market map. So another different market map looking specifically at container management and orchestration software. And no question that it's highlighted by Kubernetes leading with a pretty wide margin. Nevertheless, our surveys look at, we tend to get survey data from enterprise IT decision makers, a lot of IT buyers, and you see a little bit more diversity in terms of, I think if you poll developers, it's usually all about Kubernetes. But when you get on the IT operations side of organizations, it tends to be more of that mixed use reality. You do see Docker Swarm, you do see Mesos and Mesos for DCOS, you do see Rancher, and you do see HashiCorp Nomad, all of which are open source software projects, with vendors backing them. But we basically found that there's more than 4 dozen vendors supporting Kubernetes. There's a couple of dozen vendors supporting Swarm and Mesos for DCOS, and then down to a dozen, between a dozen and 20 vendors supporting those other 2 options. And I like to make the analogy to the public cloud. AWS is the clear leader, certainly if we look at revenue, but certainly Azure, Google, Alibaba, and other public clouds matter quite a bit in the market and are certainly still relevant in the market. And I think a similar situation exists in container management and orchestration software. And again, all of the leading container management and orchestration software is open source, and that sort of plays into this mixed use. They're commonly used together. They're meant to work together. The vendors behind them are supportive of the other options. And we do see further evidence, I guess, of the mixed market is that the big three hyperscale public cloud providers, AWS, Azure, and Google, all support all of the main 5 options that I talked about, whether it be officially or through plugins, integration, and community. But these are all used on the different clouds. So kind of interesting, and it's pretty consistent when we talk to both vendors and end users that there is this case of mixed use. And there's a few reasons for it. I think there are sort of the technical drivers. There's technical reasons why you would use Docker Swarm. There's some simplicity there, and it's bundled in with the container engine. So it makes sense, I think, for initial uses and for developers that are starting to use Swarm. Mesos has connections to big data technologies such as Apache Cassandra, Spark, and Kafka, and big data applications, and thereby it has a presence already in enterprise data centers and infrastructure. And so we see that continuing. There is another simplicity aspect of Rancher being used often with Kubernetes, or primarily with Kubernetes, I should say. And so, complexity is one of the biggest challenges with Kubernetes. So Rancher tries to simplify that and has gained some support in doing so. And HashiCorp Nomad has connections to other prominent software, primarily the Terraform workflow automation software, and also their Vault Secrets management. But again, this is another one that we hear about on the IT operations side of organizations. So it's worthwhile keeping an eye on them. We expect, going forward, there does seem to be an effort to standardize on Kubernetes, but the reality is that it's going to take a while to get there. And when we can look back in historically in enterprise systems management software, there has been, it's been a case of mixed use, whether it be 10 or more years ago in BMC, CA, HP, and IBM. Wouldn't be uncommon to see more than one of those deployed at a large enterprise across all of its divisions. And then more recently saw this with Chef, Puppet, Ansible, and Salt in infrastructure automation software, whereby those are commonly, it's typical to see them more than one of those options deployed at an organization, and they are supportive of one another, right? They don't say you have to throw out all your Puppet if your Chef come in, or vice versa. They'll say you may, eventually want to go with our software because of whatever advantages we can provide, but they are supportive of one another, and again, open source software. So that's definitely a big part of this market, but nevertheless, it's still producing revenue. So I think, interesting to see that happening, and there's no question that vendors are making money through these open source software projects, but certainly also participating in these open source software projects. And another, I think, interesting change or dynamic in the market is the participation of large end users in open source software projects. They're having increasing, growing their participation, and they see the advantages of steering the software and determining the roadmap and getting the features and functionality that they want. They see the rewards of participating in these communities. So I think it's good to see the end users helping to drive these communities. So now we'll sort of go back up to a higher level before we get to some questions. We have a couple of good ones that have come in, so we'll look forward to answering those. But first, we'll just do a little bit more high level and looking at, what are the drivers, what are the challenges, and what's sort of the outlook? Where are we headed with containers in the market? And this is just sort of showing continued growth of containers. If we look at this now, they represent, mostly a quarter or fewer of organizations' x86 servers running containers. Pretty still significant, given where we are, early days. 3.5 years, I'd say containers have been, modern application containers, I should say, have been in the market. and maybe like 2.5 years or so for the container management and orchestration software. So it's still early days, and this is pretty consistent with what we've seen, around the number of organizations that are running containers in a significant way. If we look ahead a year, we see that now it turns to mostly a quarter to half of x86 servers are running containers. So continued growth. I think it's also interesting to see that the zero number drops to nothing. So indicative that everyone will be in on containers within a year. But I think it does, that does coincide with what we're seeing. It's beyond just the early adopters now, beyond the bleeding edge enterprises, and it's certainly headed toward more mainstream enterprise organizations and moving there more rapidly than we've seen previous trends, as I mentioned before. When we compare this to DevOps, it's taken DevOps, nearly 10 years to get from just the bleeding edge deployments to more mainstream enterprises where we see it today. And so I see a similar path for containers, perhaps more rapidly this time. So in talking about, and I've talked a lot about the drivers, it has been typically around speed. You see this sort of, but this is kind of an interesting perspective on what are the biggest benefits, after sort of adoption. And it's still about developers. I think it's mainly about speeding and driving productivity for developers. Also interesting to see the isolation and security. Security has consistently been, a bit of a hard one to figure out because there are a lot of people that talk about container security benefits and the security benefits of containers. There are some isolation, reduced attack surface advantages. But actually, and we'll see another slide later, security is mostly seen as a challenge. And I think that, that is around the lack of parity with VMs. And so even though there are some security benefits to be had with containers, it does present some security challenges, particularly when you consider what organizations expect in terms of isolation, multi-tenant security capabilities around VMs, which have been around in the enterprise for a long time. I'll talk a little bit more about how containers and VMs relate later on. But I think we also see efficiency and portability as big benefits, and I think that's becoming more and more important, in large part because of that timing with hybrid cloud and the ability to seamlessly move into applications and their dependencies and their data across different infrastructure that includes public clouds, private clouds, and on-premise infrastructure, which certainly still matters, I think, for most of these hybrid scenarios. We've seen the containers play a big role in that, and I think increasingly the container management and orchestration software. As a distributed application framework, which is what Kubernetes is, it's a good fit for hybrid cloud, and that continues to be a theme. I expect that to continue to drive the container management and orchestration software, which will bring along the container applications with it. In terms of the hurdles or challenges, I think, again, we see that double-sided coin of security, but I think the challenge there is mainly that lack of parity with VMs. They set a pretty high bar for containers in terms of security. And VMs have been around for a long time. It sort of goes hand in hand with the next issue, compliance and regulatory concerns. And those, security and compliance and regulatory, those are the top issues that we hear about from enterprises in regards to cloud computing adoption in general. So consistent there, I think you see sort of the synergy of the containers with cloud adoption, but still some concerns around security, compliance, and regulatory issues. And those are valid concerns. We see security incidents help to drive, I think, some of this concern, rightfully so. And I think organizations, when it comes to the compliance and regulatory concerns, they've sort of built that up. And if it's working, it's hard for them to see a need to move on. We also see complexity as a big challenge. And I think that is among the biggest issues with Kubernetes. It's growing rapidly. There's a lot of hype helping fuel it and some real substance to this market with 50 plus vendors supporting it. But there is a complexity and, as I outlined before, a lack of skills. And those are valid concerns for organizations. And we also see here some issues around production use. And I think, again, indicative of this is still an early market, even though containers have been in the enterprise a few years and container management and orchestration software has been in the enterprise for a couple of years. That's still early days, and particularly for more mainstream organizations. But as we've seen in past trends like PaaS and DevOps, the more mainstream and some of the mid-sized organizations do tend to follow the bleeding edge companies. In financial services, insurance, telecom, healthcare, retail, and the public sector. This chart also indicates some inertia and the fact that the VM process is sufficient for a lot of organizations. And again, this is another from our survey of container-using organizations. So even there is some persistence of VMs, and this highlights that there is good tooling and management and security and other capabilities around VMs. VMs are typically pretty battle-tested for organizations that are deploying them, and they are the currency of enterprise IT today. So again, we expect cases. That's a nice segue into my next slide, and this is sort of just looking at where we are, where we're headed with this. If you go back 2 or 3 years, most containers were running on top of or inside of VMs at organizations. And I think, it might sound counterintuitive, and certainly back in the containers would say, why would you do such a thing? But it's been the enterprise reality. And enterprises, sort of get the best of both worlds. They are able to serve their developers with containers and help speed them, make them more productive, and they get their sort of tried and true VM process and their good VM tooling and the people that run those VMs. So, that has been that was sort of the leading use case for container applications being run on top of or inside of VMs. And as you see, in the next 2 years, we project, it still will be significant. But we think we're starting to see this shift. And I think organizations are hitting the point where whether the developers are demanding it, whether the scale that they're getting to demands it, whether hybrid cloud is demanding it, we're starting to see this change. And we expect as we go forward, we'll see more containers running separately and in place of VMs. And we also see the growth of bare metal deployment, just a sliver of that starting in the next couple of years. We hear about that starting with some large enterprise organizations, and so we expect that to grow as well. Well, we've got a few questions, so I am going to move into those and take a look at them. So one of my first ones here, now it says Solaris containers have been in production use for nearly a decade. And I think this is why sometimes you'll hear me stipulate that I'm talking about modern application containers. Yes, we have had software containers, and it is a similar concept although I do think Solaris containers would be closer to a system container that is, a slicing up of the operating system. It is a similar type of isolation. It is a different type of packaging. I think that's what Docker and Rocket and some of the modern application software that we're talking about primarily, that's what differentiates it from being modern, is that, again, you could have done containers in Solaris. There are many organizations still using Linux containers. However, I think, Docker is the one that developers want. That is what represents this sort of democratization of containers, to where you don't necessarily have to be an expert in Solaris or in Python or Java to get container applications that are Python or Java applications. And there is a simplification, and it's built on LXC and what's been done with containers already, but there is a difference with the modern application containers. And it seems as that's the way that most enterprises view it as well. The next one is, are containers important to network teams, server teams, or to DevOps? And it says especially from a monitoring perspective. Well, I think, primarily the audience has been the developers and DevOps teams. And we have some survey research that reflects it's mostly DevOps teams looking at containers. I think as we go on, as container applications and container implementations mature, it becomes more and more a matter for IT operations and networking admins and storage admins. So we're starting to see that, and I think increasingly it will be, the realm of network teams. But we have seen with previous trends like OpenStack, a lot of times their needs are addressed after the developers, and so there's some, there will be some gaps that need to get filled, and we're tracking 150 plus vendors who are working on doing just that, and many of them are in crossing into the network space, into the storage space. So I think it's primarily for developers and DevOps teams, but increasingly you're seeing the IT ops teams, the network admins, the sysadmins being pulled into running containers. And in terms of monitoring, again, that's a big, seems to be an immediate need when you start thinking about running container applications in production. Here's an interesting one that I think we've gotten before. How much of the market is public cloud versus on-premise software? And yeah, that's a good question. I think this is very much mixed, just the way we see multi-hybrid cloud. We did a survey last year that asked, where do you want your container as a service software? Do you want it hosted in a public cloud? Do you want it on-premise? Or do you want a mix of both? And the top answer, more than half, well, I think it was nearly half, maybe 40% of respondents said they preferred the mix of on-prem and public or hosted version. And then you had another, quarter or so that said on-prem or public hosted. So we do see this mix, and I think most of the vendors offer the mix. They offer their software in the cloud as a service or on-prem, and if they don't, they typically tend to gravitate toward offering both. We've seen that quite a bit, so I expect that to continue, and I think we have a pretty even split of this software being deployed in the public cloud. There's a lot of desires to have the control of it on-prem, so deploy it in the public cloud, but control it on-prem. And there's a whole host of different scenarios for hybrid cloud that involves both public clouds, private clouds, and also on-prem infrastructure. There's a question specifically about the security market and the drivers there, and any other highlights of the container security subsegment that we have. And, other than saying that we saw, almost a rush of vendors to this market, and we've seen how security is sort of viewed as one of the top issues, and also viewed as an advantage by some folks. I think that's all driving this. And, again, I'd come back to the VM sort of bar that is set in terms of security and isolation for containers. I think that's where organizations want to be able to serve their developers and run containers, but their first line of questioning for the team or the developers that want to run the container, or the operators, I should say, is, what does this have in terms of isolation, multi-tenancy, security that we have with VMs? And so I think that question will continue to drive that market, and we'll see it continue to grow. And even though it's a smaller segment, again, I think it's an important segment of the container market, just given the priority on security. The organizations are deploying container applications as they make their way to production. They're going to need that to be secure. And you also have this sort of DevSecOps trend having an impact here. Containers are now another tool of DevOps teams that are looking to iterate and move faster and be more sort of proactive in the market. And so, these calls to sort of incorporate and inject security as early as you can into the development process, I think that will help perhaps drive the container security subsegment as well. Just looking at some of our other questions, we'll probably be able to get to a few more. Here's one. Do you have a split between stateful and stateless container applications? Yeah, I would say that ratio. I would know what the exact ratio would be. I would say it would most likely be mostly stateless. Again, the last 3 years ago, it's all been stateless, mostly web and mobile apps, mostly test and dev. But we are seeing, I think, a pretty strong growth of that stateful applications that require data persistence. So I would expect that to, the number of stateful, that ratio will probably see the stateful start to catch up to the stateless, but I think it'd be mostly stateless at this point. Here's a good one. Are containers going to get leapfrogged by functions? I think this is a reference to functions as a service, also known as serverless. And yeah, I think this is interesting. Again, I come back to that sort of chronological order of adoption that we've seen in the enterprise. It's not always exactly in this type of order, but it tends to be cloud computing first, get your head around efficiently using public cloud resources. Then comes those sort of DevOps, internal developer self-service environments, and dealing with big data applications and big data technologies. Then we tend to see containers and microservices, which sort of go hand in hand. And then we see serverless coming. And I think it makes a lot of sense for a lot of organizations as they're doing, one of the reasons that the public cloud providers are significant in container management and orchestration is that it's a natural for organizations serving their developers to already with public cloud to use a container as a service from that public cloud provider. And so it will be a natural that they use their serverless or their FAS, their functions as a service. However, I think it's a little bit like asking if containers are going to, leapfrog DevOps. In fact, we did hear some of that. And it turns out containers are just another tool for DevOps. And when you look at the functions as a service, those services most often are based on containers used by the provider. And so, I think that the two will sort of go hand in hand. I think you might see serverless will be sort of compared to containers as organizations, look to, best serve their developers. So, there may be some disruption to containers, but I sort of see them going hand in hand. And an organization, they don't want to sort of put all their eggs in one basket. And so that's going to maintain mixed use, even when we look at different types of implementations, containers and serverless. Okay, I'll try to take a couple more here. Here's sort of another comparison to another technology, and then maybe we'll wrap it up here. But what impact do I foresee containers having on Hadoop? I've mentioned big data technologies like Spark, Hadoop, Kafka a couple of times, and it's mainly in relation to this sort of second wave of container applications that are more data rich, data stateful applications that require data persistence. So I think that while Hadoop is a key big data technology, I think that containers may help to sort of prolong its life and also sort of fuel use of Kafka and Spark, Cassandra, other big data technologies as these stateful applications are containerized. One of the questions that I get is what stateful applications are? Well, it's mostly databases. Databases of all kinds, whether it be a traditional relational database, an open source database, a NoSQL database, those are all being containerized. And I think that represents the bulk of these stateful applications being containerized. So I think that's going to sort of buoy and help to prolong the importance of technologies like Hadoop. And this sort of gets to, I'll sort of wrap it up to a close here. This does get to sort of a pretty widespread impact that containers have on these other technologies and trends, whether it be serverless, whether it be big data applications, whether it be DevOps. Containers play a role really in all of these. And again, that good timing for containers, it's not just limited to cloud. Containers and container management orchestration software are timed well with enterprise adoption of the cloud, with the maturity of DevOps and its move to mainstream, and with the sort of progression of big data applications and data analytics. And also I think the fact that the components that we're talking about here are open source software and that end user participation, all of those things I think are going to help to really drive innovation in this space. And so you'll see containers continuing to be relevant across all these other areas through sort of all the integrations and all the combinations that are possible through open source software, which is modular and compatible with each other typically. So I'm going to wrap it up here. I thank everyone for joining and for the good questions. We do have some contact links up here for folks, questions for me or further questions about our Market Monitor service. Please reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk about what is possible. And thanks everyone for your time. Have a great rest of your day.